Hi. Today, rather than just talking about notes, I want to talk about the gaps between them, things called intervals. Now, when we talk about scale theory and that, we always kind of measure on what are the notes in a scale, or chords, what are the notes in the chord, and so on. Just as important is what's the distance between those notes, because really that's what you hear when you hear a piece of music. You're hearing the notes going up, going down, you're hearing the melody, or you're hearing notes against each other in a chord. It's how the whole thing's built up. It's the relationships between the notes that's important. So let's have a look now at intervals. It's quite a big subject, so I might end up splitting this over a number of different videos, but just get started here with some of the basics. An interval is a gap between notes. So you could have a small interval, or you could have a big interval. The intervals are measured in semitones, which conveniently are frets. So an interval of one semitone is one fret. Going from C up here to a C sharp or a D flat is one semitone. Some terminology to be familiar with, which is important. When we have a note that goes from one place to another, like this, that's an interval. If the interval goes up, it's called an ascending interval. If it goes down, it's a descending interval. So they're measured in semitones, and the other thing to know is if it's called a melodic interval or a harmonic one. A melodic interval is where the notes occur one after the other, as if they were in a melody. And a harmonic interval is where the two notes occur together in harmony. Thing to remember though is a harmonic interval or a melodic interval, it'll still have the same sound. Why is that? Okay. So an interval is a gap between notes, and you can tune your ear in, and it's a really useful skill to have, to be able to recognise different intervals just by ear. Okay. Now the most simple interval you will ever come across is an interval called unison, or zero semitones. So if we went from C to C, that's an interval of unison. Okay. Let's take a bigger interval. Let's go from a C to a G. Now if you know the C major scale, you know that C, D, E, F, G. G is the 5th degree of C major. So if we go from C to G, that interval there is 5th distance between the 1st degree of the major scale and 5th degree of the major scale. Right, so that interval there, that perfect 5th, as it's called, is from C to G. Now, if you measure that in terms of semitones, C to G is an interval of 7 semitones. So you need to remember that when we talk about naming intervals, we tend to do it with regard to where notes occur in a scale, rather than just the absolute number of semitones. So that is between the root and the 5th degree of a major scale. So we'll call it a perfect 5th. It's 7 semitones, it's not a 7th. The 7th would be the interval between the root and the 7th degree of the scale. Okay, so bear that in mind. Now that perfect 5th there between C and G has a particular sound. By way of comparison, let's have a look at the interval between the C and the 3rd degree of the major scale. In case of C would be E, so that's C, D, E. That interval there, that's between the root and the 3rd degree of a major scale, and that's called a major third. It's 4 semitones. Now that interval is called a major third, and that interval there is a perfect 5th. I'll explain later on why some intervals are major and some are perfect. But for now, just stick with the name. Major third, perfect 5th. Now those intervals sound different, so don't think so much about the notes that we're here and think about the the relationship between them, the distance between them. That major third there and that perfect fifth, that sounds like a bigger interval. It's more of a leap up from the bass note to the higher note. Okay, now that sound, the unique sound of the interval, that moves anywhere on the neck. So if I'm playing in the key of C major and I go to the third degree, I get the sound of a major third between C and E. But if I'm playing in the key of, say, E major, and I go between E and the third degree of E major, which is G sharp, that still has a major third sound to it. Compare that to the major third starting on C and the major third starting on E. Yeah. Think now about, say, the perfect fifth from E up a perfect fifth up 7 semitones gets us to the fifth degree of the E major scale, which is B. And hear how that compares to the sound in the perfect fifth starting from C. Yeah, it's got the same feel to it. Compare those two major thirds on C and E. And the perfect fifth. And if you play that interval of 7 semitones anywhere on the neck, it's always a perfect fifth. It's always got that sound to it, regardless of what the bottom note and the upper note are. It still has a perfect fifth sound to it. Likewise, the major third, I can take that anywhere from any root note and any note 4 semitones higher, and it always sounds like a major third. And that's why learning intervals are important, because you don't need to worry so much when you hear a piece of music and not knowing what key it's in. As long as you can recognise the intervals, you know how far up or how far down notes are going. Okay. Now I always say that the major scales are reference point for everything that we do. So let's take a look at C major scale and look at some of the intervals that we've got in there between the C root note and the various degrees in the scale. Okay, if you've got a copy of PhatPhish, it might be useful to dial in the C major scale now for reference. But what we're going to do is just use the C major scale based around this box here. Okay, so let's look at the first note in the scale, C major, the 1 degree. And I mentioned this interval before, the interval of unison, the interval between C and C. And that always sounds the same regardless of where you are. There's just no difference between the two notes. So C to C, G to G, D to D. You can hear that interval very, very easily. Next interval in the major scale that we're going to look at is the interval between the root and second degree. That's an interval of 2 semitones and is called a major second. The interval between the root degree of the major scale and the second degree of the major scale. It sounds like that. And as with all the other intervals, we come across an interval of 2 semitones. Sounds the same. It sounds like a major second regardless of where you play it. You've got the same distance, the same uplift between the first and the second degree. Next one we've mentioned before, the interval between the root and the third degree. Interval of the major third. Got an interval between the root and the 4th degree of the major scale of 5 semitones. And that's called a perfect fourth. Root and the 4th degree of the major scale. The interval is a perfect fourth. And that sounds like a perfect fourth, regardless of where you play it on the neck. Next one we've talked about before, the perfect fifth between the root and the 5th degree, 7 semitones. Interval between the root degree and the 6th degree of the major scale is a major 6th, and that's 9 semitones. and sounds like 9 semitones, a major sixth regardless of what the root note and upper note are. Next one is the interval of a major seventh. It's the interval between the root note and the 7th degree of the major scale. That's 11 semitones, and it sounds like that regardless of what you're using as the root note and the upper note. As long as you've got that 11 semitone interval, it's got that same sort of sound. Okay, the last interval we're going to talk about for now is the octave, the perfect octave, which is the interval between the root note of the major scale and the same note name but 12 semitones higher. And that sounds the same regardless of where we play it. Okay, so then let's recap there what we've got, the intervals within the major scale. We've got unison between first degree and itself, major second between the root and the second degree, a major third between the root and the third degree, perfect fourth between the root and the fourth degree, perfect fifth between the root and the fifth degree, a major sixth between the root and the sixth degree, a major seventh between the root and the seventh degree, and the perfect octave between the root and the same note, 12 semitones higher. Okay, so having looked at those intervals within the major scale, what next? Well, it's really useful to be able to recognise the sound of the intervals, and it's helpful to, for learning them, if you can pick up on the particular sonic qualities of each interval. Think of something like the perfect fifth interval there. You know, it's quite, relatively speaking, quite a resolved interval. It doesn't feel particularly restless. If you take an interval like the major seventh, that 11 semitone interval there, you can hear it's got a much different sound. It's more than just the fact that you're going up further from the root note to get to the second note. It just has a less resolved sound, and that degree of resolution is present whether you're hearing it as a melodic interval or as a harmonic interval. Yeah, it's still got that feel to it, like it wants to go somewhere, whereas the perfect fifth is much more settled. So as a starting point, look at those intervals within the major scale and get your ear used to the sound of them. It's a really useful skill, and if you want to get into transcribing other people's music, being able to hear when you start on one note and then where does it go, being able to hear, oh well, that's an interval of 4 semitones, or it's an interval of 5 semitones, or whatever. It's really, really useful for being able to work out music just by ear. And then you can extend that skill, and for when you're doing improvisation and so on. There's a lot more theory to intervals, which I'll talk about in future videos. For now, let's just settle on looking at the intervals within a major scale. So get used to the way that the sound, being able to find those intervals, interval of 4 semitones or 5 semitones or 7 semitones, wherever, anywhere on the neck, and being able to recognise them by ear. Okay, there's plenty there for you to be practicing with, and I'll catch you in another video sometime in the future, and we'll talk about intervals in a bit more detail then. Bye for now.